Hi guys, this is Vineet, and in today's video we will talk about protocols configuration within SQL Server. So before we proceed ahead, I would like you to go ahead and hit on the subscribe button for my channel. You will find that button below the video. And right next to it there is a bell icon. You can hit on the all button to get all future notification and regarding any future videos that will be posted by me. So let's begin. Let me take you to notes. So all right, so we are starting from shared memory network configuration. So let's talk about shared memory protocol, and this protocol is used only for the local connections. And if this protocol is enabled, local clients on the local LAN can connect to your server by using this protocol, which is shared memory protocol. And if we don't want our local clients to use this protocol, we can disable it. Let's see how we can enable and disable it. So in order to do that, you need to open the SQL Server Configuration Manager. So yeah, type it here and it will list that out. So open that SQL Server Configuration Manager. So once it is opened, you need to expand the SQL Server Network Configuration node. So this is the network configuration node. And then we need to select the protocols. So on this system we are running two instances of SQL Server. The MS SQL Server is the default instance. Another one is instance one, which is the named instance on this machine. So we need to select one of the instances, and suppose we want to configure the protocol configuration for our default instance. We need to select this protocol. On the right hand side you will see protocol listed for this instance or default instance. And there are three protocols: shared memory, named pipes, and TCP/IP, out of which only shared memory is enabled. So once this protocol is enabled, local connections can connect to this server, which are on local LAN. So we need to select one of the protocols for which we want to work with. And for now so I'm right clicking on this and selecting properties. So right now the only configuration option available to us is to enable or disable this protocol. There are no other configuration options available. We can disable this protocol if we don't want any local clients to use the SQL Server system on our LAN. Yes, we can then disable it by selecting no. For right now, we are leaving it to enabled. All right, let's go to next topic. Go back to notes. So next topic is the name pipe network configuration. So name pipe is another protocol used by SQL Server, and it is primarily used for connections by applications written for earlier version of Microsoft Windows. And when we enable name pipes, it uses the name pipes net library. If this protocol is enabled, it uses a name pipes net library to communicate over standard network addresses. So this is the type of configuration we give for default instance, and this is for the name instance. So for example, our machine has instance 1, so we need to give this instance. The syntax is this for pipes. And in addition to enabling or disabling the use of name pipes, we can configure the properties of this protocol and change the name pipe to use. So let's see how you can configure the name pipe. So let's quickly move on to SQL Server Configuration Manager, which we have just opened. So right now the name pipe protocol is disabled. So we have selected this protocol, double click on it, or maybe you can right click on it and select properties. Other options available are you can enable or disable this protocol from here. But yeah, for now, let's go to properties. So this dialog box will appear. So first option is to enable or disable this protocol. So right now it's disabled. If we want to enable it, we need to select the yes option. Alright, so yes can be used. or otherwise we can select no to prevent the protocol from being used. And here we can change the name of the default pipe. So this is the default pipe configuration as I have shown you in my notes. So for any named instance pipe, configuration needs to be modified a little bit slightly. So now let's move on to this configuration. We can change the name of the pipe here. And after making changes to the configuration, we can click on OK. So alright, we are done with the named pipe configurations. So let's go back to configuration manager. So right now this is disabled. So third protocol which can be used is the TCP/IP network configuration protocol or TCP/IP protocol. So let me take you to notes. So this is the preferred protocol for connections to SQL Server. So almost all the World Wide Web uses TCP/IP to communicate with each other. So yeah, this protocol therefore can also be used while communicating with SQL Server. So when you use TCP/IP, SQL Server listens on a specific TCP/IP port on all the IP addresses. So this is default. By default, SQL Server listens on TCP/IP port 1433 on all IP addresses that are configured for its network cards. And for any security reason, we can make changes to this configuration, and the configuration can be configured in two ways. So first thing is you can configure SQL Server to listen on all the configured IP addresses to use the same TCP/IP port configuration across many IP addresses. I think this is the default one. Another one is we can configure SQL Server to listen only on specific IP addresses and configure each TCP/IP port separately for each IP address. This can also be done. So during the configuration, there is also an option to specify the TCP/IP listening port manually or dynamically. So once we manually assign any TCP/IP port, so let me take you to configuration manager. It would be a little bit more easier. So yeah, here it gives all the IP addresses. For this machine, I see like 6 IP addresses configured here. So for each IP address, I can make it enabled, disabled, and I can configure a specific port. So right now, see, default 1433 port is configured. So this is the default port. So if you want to manually change or assign a TCP/IP listening port, the TCP/IP port is static. So for example, for IP1, it's not using any of the dynamic ports. It's just using a TCP/IP static port 1433. So if you want to change any the new static port, we can change it to a new value and hit apply and OK button to configure that port. But yeah, if you want to dynamically assign a TCP listening port whenever you start the related service. So once we dynamically assign the TCP/IP listening port whenever the related SQL Server instance dynamically assigns the TCP/IP listening port whenever you start the related service. So right now dynamic ports is not configured. So and these dynamic ports are assigned at service startup, and if the ports are set to be assigned dynamically to SQL Server, then there should be a client application that need to determine the incoming listening port for a SQL Server. So this service is provided by one of the services, which is the SQL Server browser service. So when a SQL Server instance uses dynamically assigned TCP/IP ports, the SQL Server browser service checks for incoming connections and direct them to the current port or the correct port for related SQL Server instance. So current port is whatever port is getting used by that particular SQL Server instance. The SQL Server browser service helps in directing them to the current port, any of the client requests. So in the case we are using firewalls, we shouldn't be using the dynamically assigned ports. So basically, if we use dynamically assigned ports with firewalls, we experience connection problems. So let me show you how you can enable disable the TCP IP configuration. So yeah, it can be done within the SQL Server Configuration Manager. So I was looking at the TCP IP properties. So first, let me take you to protocol tab. It has two tabs, protocols and IP addresses. So we are talking about the protocol tab. This tab can be used to enable or disable this particular protocol. Yes to allow protocol to be used, and select no to prevent the protocol from being used. And also in the protocol tab, you can configure the parameters that control whether and how the SQL Server instance tries to maintain the TCP IP connection. So for each connection, it keeps the connection alive for 30,000 seconds. We will talk about, okay, let's talk about the listen all option. So these, there are two parameters which are used. So what do we mean by listen all? Options are yes and no. So it controls whether the SQL Server listens on all IP addresses or just on specific IP addresses. So by default, it's listening on all the IP addresses. So if this value is set to no, you must configure each IP addresses separately using the related property boxes on the IP addresses tab. So yeah, let me tell you about this. So if it is set to yes, so any of the options we configured here under IP all, these settings applies to all the IP addresses being used on this machine. So if I configure anything under IP all and the listen all option is set to yes, these settings will apply to all the IP addresses that are coming above. So our machine has 6 IP addresses, so it will apply to all these 6 IP addresses. But if it is set to no, then it requires each IP address to be configured individually. So I think you got it. Second option is keep alive. So keep alive controls, now, right now it's set to 30,000 option. So it controls how often SQL Server tries to verify that the computer at the other end of the remote connection is still available. So it checks after maybe I think 30,000 milliseconds or seconds. So this is milliseconds. I have just checked. So by default, SQL Server checks for remote connection after it has been idle for 30,000 milliseconds or 30 seconds. And in most cases, we configure the values between 30 and 60 seconds. That should be sufficient. So it depends upon how much your server is busy and the importance of client activity regarding the value you configured for this setting. So this is basically to ensure that idle connections are not terminated. For example, if you could use a smaller value such as 15,000, 20,000 milliseconds, 15 to 20 seconds, it ensures that idle connections are validated more often. So it's just a basically connection validation procedure that the connection is still valid with the client or client connection is still active. Just check after 30 seconds as per the current settings. So once you configure all these settings, what you can do, you can click on apply and OK. So right now this protocol is not enabled on my machine. So now we are talking about using the static IP configuration. So let's come to the IP address. So here we are using the listen all as yes. So you can configure settings under the IP all section. Right now it's not using dynamic ports, but TCP/IP static port 1433. So I'm on the IP addresses tab, and we are getting a list of IP addresses, and these are in numerical order: IP1, IP2, IP3, and so on. Right now SQL Server is set to use listen all to yes, so any settings configured under this section IP all will be applied to all these IP addresses. And this is a loopback address. So earlier we told you, if you want SQL Server to listen on all the configured IP addresses on the server, we should set this option to yes. And on IP addresses section, we need to scroll down to get to this section IP all. And here we need to configure the port settings. So the default port settings is 1433. And to change the TCP listen port, type the port. If we want to change it, we can use any other value. Other option is, if we want to enable listening on a specific IP addresses and TCP/IP ports, we should set this option to no. And then we need to go to the IP addresses tab, and we can configure each of the individual options against these IP addresses. So guys, on the IP addresses tab, you can specify the addresses that SQL Server should actively listening on by setting their IP address entries. So for example, for this IP address, we can configure, for this IP address, we can configure a specific port. And once it is done, and we can click on apply and OK. So if we want to disable any IP addresses, we can do it from here. We can select active to no. This will disable the listening for that particular IP address. So for each IP address, we have this active option. So once these options are configured, you can click on OK. So SQL Server can listen to multiple TCP/IP ports on the same IP address. So here we have a single port configured. So if we want SQL Server to listen on multiple IP addresses, we can configure it like this. We can specify additional IP addresses separated by commas. And you need to be sure that you don't insert a space after comma. And TCP port field is limited to total of 2047 characters. So this field can go up to 2047 characters, and we can specify the list of ports SQL Server listen to on this TCP IP address. Now let's talk about, so far we have talked about the dynamic TCP IP network configuration. Let's talk about dynamic TCP IP network configuration. So again, we need to come to this section by going to SQL Server Configuration Manager, selecting protocols for the instance, and go to TCP IP properties. And we need to come to the IP addresses tab, and we get a list of IP addresses entries. So let's see where we need to configure the dynamic addresses. So our setting is listen to all yes, so our settings should be configured here for all the IP addresses. So if we want this system or this SQL Server to use the dynamic IP addresses instead of a static this one 1433, what we need to do? Give me a second, guys. Let me clarify on this. So in order to use the dynamic ports, what we need to do is we need to remove this 1433 port, and in the dynamic ports we just need to specify 0. So now the system is using a dynamic ports. This system will use dynamic ports. So here it is giving the option blank if dynamic ports are not enabled. To use dynamic ports, set to 0. So we have set it to 0. The description is coming over at the bottom. So right now the system is using dynamic ports for TCP/IP, but yeah, this is not enabled, so it will not use it. For TCP/IP to use dynamic port, you need to enable this protocol. So for now it's not enabled, and let me revert back the configuration to 1433 instead of using dynamic ports. Let me restore the default configuration. So yeah, this is done. So yeah, guys, that's it for this video, and in our next video series we will talk about configuring the security for client configurations and what should be the protocol order. We will talk about protocol order as well, and we will talk about other configuration options as well. So for now, that's it, and I thank you for your time on this, and you have a wonderful day ahead. Bye bye.